Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us for the second meeting of our Books That Move Us book club with the Sarasota Orchestra. My name is Sarah Stovall. I'm the communications manager for Sarasota Orchestra. And today I am joined by 5 other folks from our Sarasota Orchestra family. Laura Stephenson Petty, our clarinetist, is leading our discussion of today's book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. We also have our violist Nathan France with us. Our assistant production manager, Audrey Dunn, is also with us. We have Carrie Smith, our director of artistic planning. And we also have another special guest from our youth orchestra program. She's a student of Laura's. Her name's Lenora Galeziowski, and she's also with us here. So we've got a full house, and we're excited to have those of you tuning in here live on Zoom and everybody who will be with us later on Facebook as well. Now I want to start, we've got a kind of a book club icebreaker ritual that we've started. It's called What's in My Mug? And so I'll go first. This morning I'm drinking some cold brew coffee. It's a nice way to kick off the day. Who's next? What else do you guys have in your mugs? Laura, how about you?
I have coffee. Big surprise.
Yeah.
It's decaf though, so I don't get all, because I'm already high energy.
Yeah. Carrie, what about you? What do you have in your mug this morning?
Sure. I have black cold brew coffee, but I actually don't have a mug. It's in a 16-ounce glass from my uncle's retirement party. So slightly unique.
Audrey, what's in your mug?
I also did not put my beverage. It is just plain water. I don't drink caffeine, and I don't particularly like warm beverages. So
great. Let's see. I think Lenora, what's in your mug this morning?
I just have water too.
Nathan, how about you?
I'm drinking coffee as well.
Nice.
In my nice Sarasota Orchestra mug.
Very nice mug.
Yes, excellent mug. Let's see. Everybody who's tuning in today on Zoom, use the chat function and tell us what's in your mug. Let's warm up that chat. Throughout the conversation today, we encourage you to use this chat feature to share your thoughts and to keep the discussion going amongst yourselves. There's also, if you would like to contribute to the discussion with a question or something that you'd like for us, the panelists, to take up, there's also another feature here in Zoom, the Q&A. And please submit your thoughts, your questions, your provocations and discussion points there. And we'll take time as we go, as we cover the book and share our thoughts on it today to introduce your ideas and your thoughts to the discussion. And we're really grateful for everything that you all have to share. And if you're with us on Facebook, be sure to use the comment section to do that as well. With that, I'm ready to turn this over to Laura to get this going. And my question for you, Laura, is first, what motivated your selection of this book, Evicted, to bring to the table for the Books That Move Us book club?
Well, I read it probably maybe pretty soon after it came out. I had been listening to NPR, and they always have wonderful book recommendations. And this one sounded really interesting. And I read it, and first of all, I thought about eviction. I had never, it wasn't, I thought, oh, this rent, I wasn't ever going to be evicted. And so I read it, and I really couldn't put it down. And I was very affected by it. I talked about it to anyone who would listen to me. I recommended it to anyone who would talk to me about it, because I felt like it was really something that I'd never heard in the news. I mean, eviction is not talked about as in the poverty conversation, really. And it really struck me how unfair and difficult it is to overcome being evicted. Just getting a place to live. I mean, we take it for granted that we just go, I call and I have a job and I have the down payment. And if I want to live here, I can live there. I can go see an apartment. No one's going to look at me and say, no, I put the money down and I have an apartment. What would you do if you had nowhere to live and no one would rent to you, and you had to keep going down the list of available lodging to a place where people ignore those things and the level that, and then you get evicted from that place. And I just thought, how would I exist if I were any of these people? I don't know what I would do. Would I be able to do anything different? It seems like there are no options. And the only option is to just be on the street and die there. And that was really powerful for me. So why did I pick it for an orchestra book club would be another good question. Why didn't I pick something that was music related or art related, or, and for me, reading a book like this is important for people like me and probably people who are watching this, because none of us are in this situation, and probably none of us know anybody in this situation, unless you are volunteering at a food pantry, unless you are involved in activities of charity where you meet people that are at this level of existence. You don't know. And unless you read about it, unless someone says, hey, look at this, we may never know. Just like I had no idea eviction was a problem. Like it didn't register. And he says in the book, he's like, I tried to find studies on eviction. I tried to find statistics, and he couldn't find them because nobody had really done it. They thought that eviction was a result of being poor. And what he found was that it was a contributor to being very poor. So I thought people who would be in this book club, they can read lots of books about music, but let's just put one in there that maybe makes them walk in someone else's shoes for a moment. I'd love to hear if anyone does have anyone who's the type of situation we're talking about. But that's why I chose the book. And I want to start off the conversation asking some of our panelists what the most impactful part of the book was. And I'll start. For me, even though the individual stories, there were some really powerful ones, the idea of just the unfairness of it just really struck me, and how many advantages I have by just being white, just having two parents, just having a support system. If I can't support myself, someone will step in, and it just struck me as so unfair and just insurmountable, and it just broke my heart. So that's what affected me the most. How about you, Nathan?
I think as far as, the most impactful thing in the book, specifically, I'll mention one scene that really got to me is when the Eagle movers were going around, just like that's their job, just to move people's stuff out of their homes after they've been evicted, and the sheriffs go with them. And when they went to the one house and the sheriffs were at the door, and a young woman was at the door, and it was taking longer. There was a longer conversation than normal. And the movers in the truck are like, what's going on? And then they later found out that there was this teenage girl, but then inside the house were like 4 other kids, and the mom had died 2 months ago, and kids had nowhere else to go, so they were just living there, and obviously they didn't pay the mortgage or the rent, and so they were being evicted. And the fact that the movers just threw them out, put their stuff on the curb, and went on to the next house, and just that level of kind of you have to have seen so much stuff to just keep going and just keep doing that. So that was the one specific scene that really got to me. But along with that, kind of the general narrative of the book, which you mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about more, I'm sure, is that eviction is a cause of poverty, not a result of poverty. So those were the things that kind of got to me.
And how about you, Lenora? As a young person, what was the thing that affected you the most, or that you really got you, or you were surprised at?
I think that the fact that it, like the present time, but it's like a never-ending cycle, because these people have kids, and then the kids go through similar situations because it's hard to come out of it. It's harder for tenants who have children. That kind of struck me as something. And also that it's kind of like the American dream idea is kind of a fiction, basically, because it's really hard to work out of these situations from nothing, and hard work is not the only contributors to success. So
it's so interesting that those were your observations, because as a young person, I'm sure you were thinking, if I didn't have a home and I had to change schools all the time, and I just had this kind of depressive thing about, my clothes were dirty, I didn't have what other kids have, I have to change schools every few months, there's not a safe place for me to go, I don't get regular food. How is that young person supposed to overcome that? Because that's how their parents got there. And I thought, we have this whole thing of these, young people doing these crazy things, all the violence, and there's all these things that young men especially are seeing, but why? What is that child supposed to do? There's probably a lot of feelings they can't get out, they can't put words to. And it's interesting that you picked up on that the most, because that's probably what you those are your people, you're at that. So and you're probably thinking, what would I do if I had to change schools every 2 months and I was behind and I didn't have advantages? So interesting. Thank you. Audrey, what was the thing that made the biggest impression?
There was a particular, he'll intersperse facts and statistics alongside the stories of specific people that he encountered and followed. And it was fairly on in the book that he first touched on this, but, he's following both landlords and tenants. And I think he does a good job of, not portraying each of these landlords as particularly evil or anything like that. They're part of the system too. They're, trying to make a living, and they, just like the movers, have kind of shut themselves off from the feelings and despair that they see, because this is their business. But the author does point out that median rents in poor neighborhoods are not significantly lower than the median rents in other more well-off neighborhoods. And essentially, it seems like there are 2 problems that cause this. One is just that the demand for places to live is so high that they can essentially get away with charging these rents. But the other problem, which just blew my mind, was that it costs them less it costs the landlords less to go through these cycles of evicting people than to maintain their properties, and that tenants lose their rights if they are not up to date on their rent. And that just blew my mind, that your protections would be out the window if you were behind on your rent. So if you are, finding that the property is falling down around you, you for those problems, have the ability to say, call a building inspector to try and force your landlord to take care of those problems, because the landlord can turn around and evict you. And that didn't really make sense in my mind. Like, how is this possible? How is this the way that the law and the system works? But it really just reinforced the fact that, like, the way things are built right now, evictions are often in the best interest of the landlords, even though, they're not even making all of the rent that they're asking for on their properties. So that just really stood out to me, that, a plain capitalist version of housing people is not working for a lot of people.
That's interesting, because I just read an article. I don't know if our audience has probably seen the same article as I think in the Herald Tribune on January 2nd. It's very recent. And it talked about representation for tenants in eviction court, and how Maryland, Baltimore being a very, problem city for a lot of these things, that only 90% of landlords have representation in eviction court, and 90% of tenants do not, and only 70% or only 30% of tenants actually even show up to court. Because, as you can tell by the stories, it's first of all, why go if you're just be humiliated and the outcome? Why are you going to waste bus money to get down there? Or you just can't, a lot of the stories where I couldn't get to my food stamp meeting and they were cut off, these people they're not able to sort of juggle all these balls that maybe we all think, oh, of course, I've got my Google Calendar out, and well, I'm supposed to file my taxes, I'm supposed to be at the meeting. That's not their reality at all. And so Maryland is going to have a program to have free representation for tenants, and they say it can cut evictions by 86%, and therefore something like these spending $5.7 million on legal representation can save the city $34 million in homeless shelters, help, all of the things that cities just spend, just like the healthcare system. Do you want people to go to the emergency room every time they have the sniffles, or do you want to provide healthcare? It's the same thing. So there are efforts that could really help in that legal area that you're talking about, because if you go to eviction court and you say, and your lawyer says that the bathroom doesn't work, the sink is clogged, all of these things, then they won't be able to be evicted because there was a basis. But if they don't show up, or they don't have a lawyer, they don't have any rights, then they just get evicted. And I'd like to point out too that even if you call because your apartment is substandard, if you'll recall, and Nathan and I talked about this also, was the tenant who called domestic violence, called the police because she heard the domestic violence going on above her, and she was evicted because she called because there was a nuisance order on the house. So I mean, how is that to either call for help or get evicted? Who's going to decide that? And here you have women, they have to live with someone to just rent a place, maybe they're with a guy, and it's terrible, what do you think about it, Nathan?
Well, yeah, I mean, after reading the book and kind of when you, as you pointed out there, I don't know if you pointed it out just now or in our pre-meeting, but the fact that there weren't very many studies about evictions, and when Matthew Desmond was writing the book, he tried to research facts and figures and discovered there was a lack. So he did his own research. And in light of all that, after having read the book, you look and you say, like, a lot of these laws or a lot of the ordinances that are in place, right? Like the nuisance house law, where if there are 3 calls to the police, it becomes a nuisance house, and the owner of the property, the landlord, is susceptible to a $1,000 to $5,000 fine or jail time. And of course, they're not going to want to pay a $5,000 fine or go to jail. So their only recourse is to evict the tenant. So they submit the paperwork, and then the police get back and say, or the agency gets back and says, that's an acceptable solution. Like, when that's not an acceptable solution, right? But there's the courts and the agencies are so inundated with all these requests and everything that the easiest solution is just to put a stamp on it and say, like, that's an acceptable solution, because what else can they do? They can't really do it. So yes, and it's kind of like us sitting here, we can all look at it and say, like, that just doesn't make any sense. There's no common sense to a woman calling about domestic violence and then getting evicted. That just makes no sense. But we also are not there. We don't know, we can't wrap our heads around the depth of the problem nationally. And in this case, in Milwaukee, just the sheer numbers of cases that caseworkers have to deal with, and police calls, and then if you're Sharina, the landlord, like, how many properties does she have? And she can't be everyone's guardian angel. She's got to run her business. So it just speaks to the depth of the problem when you have these laws on the books or ordinances on the books that, when you take a step back and look at it, they seem to not make any sense at all. So how do you go about creating laws and ordinances and policies that help the people that need help, and don't allow other people to take advantage of the system?
Something you just said, Nathan, reminded me of a moment in the book that was really impactful for me. I think it speaks to how much the system and the laws sometimes don't make sense. It was when Sharina and Arlene were in eviction court together, and when Sharina had won her case with evicting Arlene, she still, as she was driving Arlene back from the courthouse, she was still saying, that's how one-sided the system is, talking about how one-sided it is for the tenant, even though Arlene was the one who had just lost. So I think it, for both people in the system, landlords and tenants who are facing eviction, and the landlords who are sometimes who feel forced to take that measure. It's baffling to both. I mean, they both feel like they are at odds with the law. So that another part of the book that I think that was most impactful for me, that Lenora was starting to tease out, was just how hard it is for people with children to deal with this and to find housing, and how just having children can be a barrier to finding to finding good housing, safe housing. It was heartbreaking to me, even though I'm not a parent, but it was heartbreaking to me to consider how those that are the most vulnerable, the children, they're caught up in this, and they are probably they're facing situations where they ultimately become the least protected by the system because of how landlords discriminate against people with children, thinking that they're too high risk or high liability.
It was, I thought, there are two there are two ways that they're a liability, because I don't know, it wasn't highlighted in the book, and it wasn't, there wasn't a mention of it besides sort of as part of the story, but they had problems. Arlene, especially, her boys would get her evicted. She was at, I'm not sure if it was her or one of the other, I don't want to misquote, but what they were at the lodge, which is a shelter, and they got kicked out because the daughter pulled the fire alarm. And then Jory, I think one of Arlene's son, got in a fight, and they were kicked out. So not only is having children a burden, but the children themselves just, having grown up in this environment, they're not going to sit at home and, they're not, no kids are angels, but, so not only was it, but it was hard to kind of control the kids, to have, to know where they are. And so I thought that was, and I think our society really judges. I've been in conversations where people are like, well, why are people having so many kids if they can't support the kids? I think a lot of America, and this leads back to what Lenora was talking about, the idea that you can get yourself out of this situation, that in America, everyone can have the American dream. If you work hard enough, if you are good in school, you'll be able to do anything you want. And you can see, what are these kids supposed to do? And their mothers, what was it? The statistic was that 3 out of 4 people in eviction court were African American, and 3/4 of those people were Black women. So it pointed out that, and it's not about, the book wasn't about race, but you couldn't get away from it, that Black mothers are the most evicted. They represent 9% of the population in Milwaukee, but 30% of the evictions. And I think people that I know have these thoughts of why are they having so many kids, and why can't they just work hard, and you can just see the energy it takes just to find a place to live. And these kids are in many schools, and I think it's just really hard to expect people to rise above. And I think people who are successful think that everyone should be able to do that. And I think the more successful the person, it seems like the more they thought they got there on their own. I see we have a psychiatrist that was, that's in our audience here. And I had read about an experiment where 3 people were playing Monopoly, and one of the 3 was given 3 times the amount of money that the other 2 had, and that person won. And they thought it was because of their skill. They disregarded that they had such an advantage. People are successful the more they think it's because of innate qualities in them. And these people that we're reading about in the book have no shot to even discover that about themselves, because just the weight of just living day to day, not next week, but today and tomorrow, is all that they can handle. Do we have any questions from the people watching, or contributions?
Not yet, but I do appreciate what Patricia said in the chat too about her experiences as a psychiatrist, and working with people who have experienced eviction, including people who we think who might. Patricia mentioned teachers, people who we feel like who at face value, it's kind of like shocking to think, oh, how could it, somebody, how could somebody in, this part of society experience that? And I think that especially now with that, we're looking at so many new people experiencing unemployment due to the pandemic. I think we're going to be continuing to feel that, to experience that kind of shock and disbelief at how precarious, situations can be and how desperate they can become for people who we think are just like us. When housing becomes jeopardized. And as Patricia brings up, the question is how to help. And she points out that sufficient social services are not sufficient here in the US. And I think that that does bring up the big question, and that's been such a big question for me personally, and I know for all of us this in the past year. 2020 was such an eye-opener of a year. Like many of us are doing the work to open our eyes to situations, to really, really hard truths about how our fellow Americans live and get by and what they struggle with. And then the question is, well, what do I do about it? Yeah, and I'm interested if I'm curious if anybody on the panel today has had any thoughts about that, about personal efficacy and what we can do in our communities to change things.
Well, I think it would be good just for a moment to talk about what's happening now.
Yes.
This book was written, at the financial crisis. And I don't get the feeling that the stories we read about in the book were a result of the financial crisis. I think these people would be in this situation any day of the week, any year. But uniquely today, we have people just like people making over $100,000 easily, at a point where they evicted and have nowhere to live and have no job and have no ability to get another job. And as a musician, I would like to say that musicians are at the top of this list. There are no concerts going on. If there are, they're very limited. So no orchestra in this country is making money off selling to 25% of their audience, right? And musicians, a musician's life is made up of different things, that teaching, their job, gigs, what we call gigs. So if you go to your local church, and they have a Sunday where they have a full orchestra, that's a gig. That's we show up for that, right? And so that's added income. All of that stopped. So I particularly think of even our the Met Orchestra. Like if I could think when I was in school, what is the most important, wonderful job that I could have? And what is my top goal in life? If I were to audition somewhere and win, what would be my perfect job? The Met would be it, right? You're living in New York City, you're playing wonderful operas, you're getting paid plenty of money. The moment this happened, gone. These people who are incredible musicians had to move home. They moved out of New York because they couldn't afford it, obviously. And the idea that people have savings in this day and age, it costs so much to house yourself. It costs so much to have a cell phone, to have internet, to stream, just to have the things of normal life. And when your income disappears, the idea that you're going to have 2 or 3 years of savings, no one knew how long this was going to go on. So people are in this situation now that would never have thought themselves in this situation. Musicians being one of them, What do you think, Nathan, about the relation of people sort of at their financial end as opposed to now?
Are you talking about then being like when Matthew Desmond wrote this book versus like the current situation we're in, or?
Well, the idea that this happens to other people, the idea that this is poor people who don't know how to run their life, who, you know, all the things that people,
Yeah, I
that
see
you
what-
see at the, you know,
I know what you're saying. Like in the part of the book at the end where he talks about this project, and I mean, Matthew Desmond clearly thinks of himself as an ethnographer, right, or like someone who goes somewhere else to live within this community or this society to come up with a story. And to your point, Laura, now you know, eviction, the central theme of the book, may be happening to more people in different stratas of society.
are they able to get out of it any better? I mean,
I think they
you
are.
know,
You know, I mean, if you think about what you were just talking about, the people, all the musicians in the Met Orchestra, they lost their jobs. They haven't been paid for 10 months, and they all had very high-paying jobs. The Met Orchestra, they make a really good living, but you can't live in New York if you're not making any money. So, you know, they all did. A lot of them just moved home or moved somewhere else or whatever. But I haven't heard of any of them living on the streets. You know, like, so I do think it is different.
Yeah.
When you're in you know, I forget in the book, but he kind of classifies poverty as like poverty and then just like abject poverty.
grinding poverty.
Grinding poverty. Yeah.
I'm not saying people evicted now or I mean the thought that this is other people who don't have their life together, who have this is something that happens to other people.
Right.
Now it's happening to people who might have read this book 4 years ago and been like, oh, well, that's terrible, and moved on with their life. I think it's so many people are actually facing having no resources. That the difference probably is that they have a safety net. All those Met musicians could move home, where people could support them, and these people in the book have nothing. And then I find it's interesting that the only person in the book, Scott, who was a nurse and was doing well, and through his own personal problems brought him low, he was the only one able to lift himself up because he had the resources, not family, but just the mental resources that had gotten him to the place, got him back.
Well, I think I mean, he could conceive of it, you know what I mean? He could conceptualize not being grinding poor. He kind of knew how to get there, and he did. But it took that social. It took a social program where I forget the name of the program, but where 30% of his income went to rent.
The subsidy, or rent,
But getting back to Sarah's initial question of like, what do we do now? I think that's obviously an important topic, and you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah.
And actually one other thing that I was going to say is that, you know, I think maybe one of the parallels that I do see between this book and the cyclic poverty that some people experience to the more sudden and recent experiences of financial instability, housing instability for mass numbers of people is really that I think maybe more people are coming around to the idea that housing is a human right, and that we do have to rely on government support for these things. You know, that there are many other government programs that people have already come to rely on and consider a necessity, right? Like free school lunches and things like that. So I suppose that one thing that may come out of the events of this last year is that hopefully more people will realize that this being housing insecure is, not something that anyone in America should have to experience as being, the richest country on earth. Getting to some things that you can do, I feel like, there are individual things we can do. And then the author also points out that, even donating to charities is sort of like a Band-Aid to the problem. He really is a proponent of seeing government take more responsibility for taking care of people, and that ultimately it can cost less, as other people have already mentioned, to take care of people, providing housing vouchers that reduce the amount of money that people are having to put toward rent so that they can educate themselves, get their GED or take college courses and improve their lives, which you don't have the energy to do when you're constantly chasing a new apartment or, figuring out how to maximize your food stamps because you're left with so little after paying the rent. But one of the things that really struck me from reading this book is the fact that when truly you're spending, 80% of your income on rent, one unexpected expense can really impact your ability to pay your rent, to pay your utilities, to buy your kid new shoes when the old ones don't fit anymore. And it so happens that I learned last month, someone that I knew decided that at Christmas time, she wanted to look into whether or not you can help others pay their bills. And it turns out you can. So you can go to the city of Sarasota and pay off someone else's water bill anonymously. So, she called them up and they led her to talk to the right person there, and they'll run a report for you to try to help identify someone who could really use that help. And similarly, they looked into can you pay someone's FPL bill, their energy bill? And it's a little bit more complicated depending on where you live. FPL does not allow you to make those payments directly, but you can through the Salvation Army. So she did that as well. And I just thought that was really interesting because in this book, he offers some pieces of information that I'd never considered before, there are certain rules that prevent people from being evicted at certain times of year, or that prevent people's heat from being shut off at certain times of year. So depending on those circumstances, when people's money is scarce, they will choose to pay one or the other, but eventually it comes back around to bite them later, if they've allowed themselves to fall behind in rent to pay their electricity, then later on, they get evicted or they get their electricity shut off if they prioritized things a different way. So being able to help someone with something like that, especially, at a time of year when money might be especially short, seemed like a really impactful thing to be able to do on a small scale. But primarily, I do feel like learning, voting is super important. And I know that I like to follow certain politicians on, say, their social media accounts and see what exactly are they doing on the day-to-day to help people. I can think of one in particular, a representative in Orlando, who has helped tens of thousands of people with their unemployment insurance claims this year. She was written up in the Washington Post for it. And I think she's been a really great example. Her name is Anna Escamani, of being someone who uses public office to help people directly. Before you can manage to get a new law passed, there are still other ways that your public officials can help. So to me, that's another thing, is just, actually staying on your elected officials for making changes that help people.
Does anybody else on the panel have some idea? Lenora, do you have any thoughts on, when you read the book and you think of your future, if you were to want to do something, what would you, in law and politics, what do you think that would really help if things changed?
Well, What do you mean by that?
Like he mentioned a voucher system,
Mhm.
and how much government, you can see in the book how the government does have help it can give, but it also restricts it, so that if you have been, seems like the people that need the most assistance are shut out from government assistance. So what would you think of sort of getting rid of some of that regulation, so that some people, more people would be able to get those resources, or is there something in your school, something people in school could do that could help any kids in this kind of situation? That's a big question, I know. But it's interesting. What do you think of that voucher system, that everyone is given sort of a minimum, so that it's almost like a basic income, but just housing?
Right.
What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think like housing should be considered like a human right. Like this country was kind of like founded on ideas of natural rights and John Locke's ideas, which was life, liberty, and property, which property was taken out of the Declaration of Independence and changed to pursuit of happiness. But
Property's happiness.
so I think most importantly, though, maybe for people my age would be just to like learn about it at this point, because I'm 17, so I can't vote at this point. But I think knowing about it and understanding it and having the ability to empathize with other people is kind of the key to starting the spread of change. Because I don't think if you don't understand it, then people won't believe it. And so it won't spread throughout and it won't become a big enough idea for people to actually want change. Because if it's a minority who wants it, then nothing will get done, most likely. So
Yeah, I think it's also, and this is, I remember when I was in high school, there were certain people that were picked on because of various things, and you didn't know what was going on in their home life, but maybe reading books like this would have kids your age look at the other people in their school, that new kid that came in and then left suddenly. Why is that? And how can I be better? I mean, I just remember, one girl in particular, and people would pick on her so much. And of course, I don't do that kind of thing. And so I would, but who knows if she was in this situation, and if kids had to read a book like this and sort of see how unfair and how insurmountable some of these kids on the lunch program, that it would lead to more support maybe at school. Do you think that's you think that would help, or do you think kids are just kind of vicious and they're going to do some vicious things no matter what? Or do you think reading books like this would open their eyes just a little bit?
I think
they read it when they were juniors and seniors.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you think, is this book on any of your reading lists, or any books like it? Do you have like a certain class that you took where you kind of read things like this?
I took an English class last year that we read the book Educated for that class, which we've talked about. And so that was kind of, we dabbled in this type of thing, but never to this level. I think a little bit of a fear of being too controversial in a classroom. So we don't go in depth on topics that should be discussed.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do some of the other panelists think about?
Laura, I just wanted to share one anecdote, I guess, from my personal life as it pertains to the Sarasota community, because I live pretty close to downtown. I'm not actually sure what my neighborhood is called, but I'm pretty close. And, I'm happy with where my rent is. I certainly don't want it to be more expensive. I think it's like, at an appropriate level, but I would say I live in kind of like a mixed socioeconomic neighborhood, as it happens pretty often in Sarasota. Sometimes you'll have like, very nice like condos and things like that. And then, and then there's sort of a variety. But I have gotten to know a lot of my neighbors through the pandemic because I go out with my dog and, there's not terribly much to do. So we chat, and that's been actually a really nice thing. And I got to know some of the kids that lived adjacent to me. They would play outside a lot, and it was a family of 3 or 4 children. And on December 31st, I was driving home and saw that there were like 4 mattresses in the yard, couches, tons of toys, books. And it looks like they moved out. They had to move out on, on December 31st. And obviously I don't think they were evicted, but I do think they had to move out and could basically only bring what was in their car. So that was really difficult to see, not only because I got to know them and, but the question of, well, where do they go now? And they have to buy all these things back again. And I love the idea of, when we think about equity, it's like helping people who would be considered vulnerable or fragile and just giving them assistance in a way that would benefit every American. But I really like that idea because with that kind of voucher system, maybe they could have stayed put. Maybe they could, or just, wouldn't be in a situation where they have to move all the time. So considering that it happened sort of in front of me, or just seeing that, there's this family I got to know that weren't quite stable enough to stay, or, couldn't move in a way that kind of afforded them dignity. I'm very much in favor.
That's tough. I mean, when you read about the Eagle Moving Company and the exploitation of not only the moving company, we'll either put your stuff on the street or we'll take it and we're going to charge you, a person who couldn't even pay rent to begin with. I mean, some of these people have $78 left. I think Lamar, the vet, he paid $550 for, and I think Audrey pointed out that the difference between a $550 and $750 apartment is huge, but $550 to stay in, a rat hole. And he had $78 to spend that month on everything else. So think about $78, So the moving company comes and they say, okay, like Lorraine, she couldn't part with her stuff because stuff is expensive. If I want to have a pot, I have to go and find it, and there are resources where you can get household items, but it takes energy and time and, to build a household. And so Eagle Moving comes and they take your stuff and they put it on a pallet and they charge you $150. And each month it's there, they charge you more. So Lorraine ended up paying $1,000 to keep her stuff. And of course they took it in the end because it was never gonna work out, And so these moving companies come and they put your stuff and they have to go find 4 more beds, and it sounds like it was quick and it, one thing I wish, and I haven't researched this, but all this stimulus money that those of us who are getting, and it's very hard for me to give up money. Honestly, I don't know what's coming. I live a nice life. I have a nice home. I have a nice husband, but how can people maybe use this money? Is there somewhere where I could go down and say, I want to help partly pay somebody's rent? There's the numbers are something like most people now, they owe back rent, and some of the CARES Act or the bill has $25 billion to put toward that, but there's something like $34 billion of debt. So is there a place where you can take your stimulus money that maybe you don't need and get and help? But I think that would be, if people felt the need. Um, I wonder if you did enough research, if you could go do something like that. So I'm being told we have to wrap this up. So I really hope that the people who read this book think about it when you think about people, and you think about taxation of the government, and you think about voting, and you think about when you are out in the street and you see someone who doesn't look like their luck is up, you know. And I'm not saying give to panhandlers, you know, I'm not saying that these people are living their best life, or that they're doing smart things with their time or money, you know, but all of us, the idea that we all have these same goals and same talents, you know. I could give a clarinet to all of you, and some of you might be good and some of you might be terrible. It doesn't mean, you know, we all have different talents. And the people in this book, just their talent was not was not getting out of this hole. I mean, the idea that we all have the same chances, like Lenore said at the beginning, and I really liked her insights. The idea of the American dream is for some people, but it's not. It is not for everyone. You know, we have immigrants in this country that work so hard, and they're not given the American dream a lot of the time. We have people in this situation, and hopefully eviction, especially now that so many people are facing it, will have a higher visibility, and that it's something that our politicians can talk about, you know. Does anybody else have something they want to say to wrap up?
I think you
Another
said it
book,
perfectly.
another book they could recommend that maybe some of our audience has a book recommendation that would also be interesting and helpful for all of us to read.
Does this look?
Oh,
The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good by Michael J. Sandel. Now I'm reading it. I haven't finished it, but it really touches on the sort of falsehood that you know, we live in a meritocracy, and it sort of explores in particular education.
That is great. Yeah, that would. It is this perpetual, you know, marching about the American dream and how great America is. Is it? Is it really? And we can do better. We can do so much better. But I think just knowledge and walking in someone else's shoes does a lot to make people aware. And if we're all more aware and more educated and more knowledgeable about other people's situations and more empathetic, then hopefully that can translate to some kind of action. And the country is having a rough time. You know, there's a lot of people who want action, and there's a lot of people who want to keep their money. So, you know, the more people who understand and empathize, the more we can maybe get that money to the people who need it, you know?
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Laura, for helping us, like bringing this book to the table, and, you know, and encouraging us to do that self-education, and like really starting where we need to, which is doing that prying of the eyes open, and you know, accepting some of that burden of the heart that some of this reading, you know, does, and that encourages us to look outside of, you know, our own little worlds, our own, you know, for some of us very comfortable bubbles, and think about, you know, ways that things need to change, and how we can be part of that. So thank you, Laura. I would like to share what we have coming up in the books of note, and the books that move us book club. First, later on in just a couple of weeks, we'll have the next episode of our Classical Music in America podcast. That's hosted by our artistic advisor, Jeffrey Kahane, and Carrie Smith. Carrie, would you like to share a couple of words about what you and Jeffrey will be talking about on the next podcast episode?
Yes, I would love to. So we are exploring two biographies of women who are critical to the history of classical music as we know it, in chronological order. Clara Schumann, who many know was the wife of Robert Schumann. She is often described or kind of ping-ponged back and forth between Johannes Brahms and Robert Schumann, but she has an incredible, incredible story, and I can't wait to chat about it on the podcast. In addition to that, Nadia Boulanger, who is a composer and pedagogue in the 20th century, and basically, I mean, she mentored so many 20th century composers that are critical household names, but hers is not necessarily. She is an amazing intellect and has a wonderful story that Jeffrey is going to speak to, and we might have a special guest on the podcast, but I don't know if I'm at liberty to confirm that yet. So
all right, stay tuned for that. And then the next books that move us book club meeting is going to be on the 1st of February. We're continuing in kind of this social infrastructure theme with what I understand is a really uplifting read called Palaces for the People. This was selected by our assistant principal cellist, Christopher Schnell. And this was NPR's one of their best books of the year back in 2018 when it came out. And it takes a look at public spaces, places like churches, museums, libraries, and parks, and how these spaces can really operate to bring people together and to create community in a time when there is a lot of social divide and a lot of division. So I think I'm really looking forward to that discussion, and I hope that everybody who's with us today will be back to join us again. I want to thank all of you, Nathan, Audrey, Carrie, Lenora, and Laura, especially for being part of this chat today. And I want to thank the sponsor of Books of Note, the Gulf Coast Community Foundation, for making these really cool and meaningful conversations possible. So with that, I want to wish you all Happy New Year and happy reading, and we'll see you next time.